The following program is brought to you by the University of Alabama.
Robert Morgan was already a widely published writer when his book Gap Creek, a story of hardscrabble life in Appalachia, was made an Oprah selection with the accompanying sales and excitement. Since Gap Creek, Morgan has published a biography of Daniel Boone, Brave Enemies, a novel of the American Revolution, Lions of the West, a study of such semi-mythological figures as Sam Houston and Kit Carson. Now he has returned to his native Appalachia in The Road from Gap Creek, the sequel to his '99 bestseller. I spoke with Robert Morgan at the Alabama Booksmith in Homewood, Alabama. Well, Mr. Morgan, it's good to see you again.
Good to be back.
I am delighted to see you again. I have recently watched our show that we did 11 years ago, after Gap Creek and after your appearance on Oprah. You were kind enough after Oprah to be on Bookmark.
I was happy to.
Which was very nice. And one of the things we were talking about then was, as often is the case, the state of fiction, the state of literature. Oprah was a boon to writers.
Oh, she was, yes.
And she's gone.
We miss her. She did more for fiction writers in that period than anybody else, I think. She sold millions of copies for a number of authors. And she got people reading who really were not used to reading, or reading better books than they were used to reading.
And I made a kind of cranky complaint about the bestseller list in our last conversation. And you said, a lot of the best books ever written were bestsellers in their time, especially in the 19th century. And we were talking about the Coopers and the Twains and the Dickens. I'd like to bring up that complaint again. I went and looked at the bestseller list recently for a few weeks. Do you think things have changed? I think the bestseller list is scary now. It's so terrible.
Things have changed. I think the culture has changed. There's something about our culture that is geared towards celebrities. If you turn on television, you see it's mostly about celebrities, and people want something that's very easy to read, something that's exciting, something that has a mystery in it often, and
or a vampire.
The number of best-selling authors are able to fulfill that formula. I think there's as much good fiction being published now as ever, but it's not getting as much attention.
Yeah, I was paying close attention to your position, which was that being on the bestseller list doesn't necessarily make a book second-rate. But my position, I guess, was crankily being on the bestseller list does not make a book first-rate either.
No,
So
it does not.
no disagreement there. After Gap Creek, which is in its own way a kind of frontier novel. I mean, Gap Creek is up there in the mountains and far from cosmopolitan, very, very isolated. But in a much more distinct and historical way, you've turned your attention to the American frontier as it moves from the Cumberland Gap to Tennessee to Kentucky to finally all the way to the Pacific Ocean. You've had now a series of books that examine westering, the whole business. You may not love this, but you're sort of the Bernard DeVoto of the 21st.
I love Bernard
21st
DeVoto.
century. Yeah. And one of these is a giant biography of Boone, Daniel Boone. Why did you do that? And what was your reason for doing it? And what would people find in your biography of Boone that would surprise them?
Well, I have always been interested in Daniel Boone. My dad was a great fan of Daniel Boone and loved to tell stories about Boone. And he said we were related to him through the Morgans. Boone's mother was a Morgan. And this turns out to be true. Two genealogists have shown me that it is true. We have a common ancestor back in North Wales, in Bala in North Wales. But from the time I was a little boy, I was interested in the frontier and in the Indians. From the time I was hoeing corn and turning up arrowheads and pieces of pottery, it seemed to me, even as a kid, that the very ground was haunted by the Indians. And I knew that their names were all over everything with their, in western North Carolina and upstate New York, as far as that goes. I wrote the biography for two reasons. One, my publisher asked me if I was interested in writing a biography.
Okay.
Take a break from fiction and work on nonfiction. And two, I thought if I wrote a novel about Daniel Boone and showed him very different from the TV Daniel Boone, the Walt Disney Daniel Boone, people would not believe it. They would say it was a work of fiction. But if I did it as a work of nonfiction with footnotes and bibliography, it would be more convincing. It would be more authoritative. So I try to squash the myth of Boone from the first sentence. I say, forget the coonskin cap. He never wore one. He wore a Quaker-style hat, and that's true. He hated the coonskin caps.
You have a picture of him in what you call a beaver felt. Not pelt, but felt.
Felt hat, right.
Yeah, it didn't look like him at all.
Didn't look like Fess Parker on television.
Right.
Well, we have only one portrait of Boone painted from life, and it was done right at the end of his life, but we get some sense of his features. You can gather what a dignified man he was, a very intelligent man. I really enjoyed the research for Boone. I had an excuse to go to Kentucky a number of times, all the way to Missouri, to Virginia, down to Pennsylvania where he was born, to visit archives in Chicago and Madison, Wisconsin, and all the places he had hunted, had hunting camps in eastern Kentucky and in the bluegrass part of Kentucky and in Virginia, the Great Valley of Virginia, and in North Carolina. He lived in North Carolina for about 20 years. He became famous really in North Carolina, living on the Yadkin River, north of Salisbury.
Yeah, there's a list of things Daniel Boone didn't do. That, the Cumberland Gap.
He was not the discoverer of Cumberland Gap.
And he didn't invent Kentucky.
He did not invent Kentucky. He was not a great Indian fighter. The legend is that he was such a great Indian fighter. He almost never fought Indians except in the Revolution, as a part of the American Revolution, when the British were sending Indians down to attack the forts in Kentucky. That's the only time he really fought Indians.
Yeah. There's one piece in there about not only did he not often fight Indians, but he didn't like to.
Oh no, he was a man of peace. He could talk his way out of almost anything.
Yeah.
He was a very good salesman, and he got along basically with Indians. He was adopted by the Shawnees. He became Big Turtle.
Not because of the hat, surely.
Well, he was very heavy built. He was a very muscular person, and that's why they called him Big Turtle.
I was interested in I don't know how to put this, the finances of Daniel Boone. In the course of his life, at one point he was very rich, or at least owned 30,000 acres or something, and he ended up broke. And so, I mean, you follow along with his... Was he just a poor businessman? Was that his problem?
He was a poor manager. And he lost most of that land in Kentucky because there were faults in the surveys. It wasn't necessarily his fault, because when they did the surveys, there weren't good maps, so it was hard to tell where somebody else's land was. And Boone lost land because he did not like to go to court and fight. If somebody sued him, he would just give it to them because he figured the frontier was unlimited. He had no interest in going to court. He hated litigation. So he was willing to lose land rather than fight for it, the way more aggressive people like Henry Clay, who made a fortune as a young lawyer, mostly in those land suits in Kentucky. Clay at one point even sued Boone I believe,
Oh.
when he was a very young lawyer. But he went to Missouri in 1799 because they offered him a free tract of land there.
Yeah.
The Spanish did, and then the French. And they treated him like a lord or something. They made him an administrator of a district, and he loved Missouri because it was still wilderness, and there were still Indians there, and his Shawnee relatives had gone there. But when the Americans took over Missouri, they stripped Boone of his land, claiming his title was not good enough.
Right. And he ends up basically broke by the end.
He was always in debt. He just simply could not manage money or property.
You followed that up after a while with a big book called Lions of the West, and this is a series of biographical studies of people who were very, very important in what I guess we're no longer supposed to call a manifest destiny.
The westward expansion.
The westward expansion. And you said early in the introduction, you talk about heroes and villains. Who are the villains of the western expansion?
Except for Johnny Appleseed, they're all at times villains.
Uh-huh.
Even the great Jefferson
Uh-huh.
did things we were ashamed of. I came across a letter where he had written to William Henry Harrison saying, make sure the Indians run up huge debts at your trading post because they will have to trade their land for the debts.
And Jackson is your villain.
Andrew
often.
Jackson is everybody's villain
Yeah.
because of the westward movement of the Cherokees, and also the way he treated the Creeks at the end of the Creek War.
Yeah.
He treated his allies very badly. But Jackson did not hate Indians. He just wouldn't let them stand in the way of the westward expansion.
Right.
He in fact adopted 2 Indians.
One of the things that you come to several places in your books is that the westward movement in North America is people first and government scrambling to catch up, so to speak. That it was individuals who were constantly moving west, and then somehow the law and legislation and what have you would try to keep up.
Absolutely, it was ordinary people who were willing to risk their lives going into Indian territory,
Right.
or going into Texas, or going into California, or going into Oregon. The government couldn't have done anything if there hadn't been all those Americans already on the ground.
Right.
So, and the same is true going into Alabama, going into Creek territory.
Right.
We think of the great leaders as making these things happen,
Right.
but they could not have made them happen if thousands and tens of thousands of ordinary people had not been willing to risk their lives to go
Yeah.
in and claim land.
Right. I think there's a wonderful paradox built into this, which is that you like to quote Emerson as history resolving itself into the lives of a few great men, and it's very Carlylean, heroes and hero worship, and yet finally it isn't great men. It's all these thousands of people with their wives who go live in the woods somewhere.
Who were so hungry for land.
Yeah.
Many of them were immigrants who had nothing. Scotch-Irish people, people from Wales. And can you imagine being on a continent where there was unlimited land and unlimited game, and you had never been allowed to hunt? That game back in the old world belonged to the nobility, and you were not allowed to shoot deer or even rabbits. And suddenly all you needed was a rifle.
Right. They moved from the deer park mentality in Great Britain to unlimited access in
Buffalo,
Yeah,
elk, beavers.
Yeah.
It was all there.
It must have been intoxicating for
It was.
a generation or two then. Among the big figures, the lions of the West, is one, a lot of them people know about or think they know about, Jefferson and Kit Carson and so on, but there's one, Trist, who's not well known. Who was Mr. Trist? What's he good for?
Well, he was actually Jefferson's grandson-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
He's not very well known, but he was a very bright man. He was trained by by Jefferson as a lawyer, and he was a very shy man. I set out to figure out why he was not known and why he had failed with so much talent, and he'd impressed everybody from Madison to Jefferson to Jackson as such a brilliant man.
Yeah.
And I discovered that he was terrified of confronting people face to face and of giving public speeches. He would rather do anything than have to give a public speech. He was a brilliant diplomat. He was sent to Mexico to negotiate an end of the Mexican War. He was sent by Jackson and John Buchanan, who was Secretary of State, and he pulled it off.
He did.
He did the impossible. He negotiated a treaty with Mexico where they ceded to the United States half their territory for $15 million.
Well, that was brilliant. But the new book, The Book of the Day, Road from Gap Creek. I want to propose a thesis for you. Tell me what you think about this. In the Gap Creek, there's misery abounding. But a lot of it is natural, that is, quite literally flood or
Fire.
or fire, freezing, or individual human meanness, like the con men who cheat Hank and Julie. In the new book, my thesis is that there's sort of large, almost global forces at work that these people don't understand. They're different catastrophes. It's the Great Depression and World War II and the death of Troy, the boy Troy, not the city. What do you think about that? I mean, is there a shift in your head in terms of the forces at work on these people and this next generation, of course, Annie and so on?
Well, it's a different time.
Yeah.
It's true that the region, my region, Southern Appalachia, changed radically in World War II. It was never the same.
Yeah.
And if you're writing about that period, the period of the Roaring Twenties, what we call the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression and World War II, history is impacting these people in ways they don't quite understand.
And maybe never had before?
It never had before.
Yeah.
In the Roaring Twenties, all these real estate developers came into the mountains of North Carolina, building resort hotels,
Yeah.
golf courses, lakes, and hiring people, including my relatives, to work on these things. And then, of course, they were devastated by the Great Depression and finally saved by the CCC. It's really true that my mother's family lived on the $9 a week she made working in the dime store.
Yeah.
And my mother's the model of Annie.
Yeah. There's a lot of your family in these. In these
It
books.
is fiction, but
Yeah.
it's based to some extent on family stories.
There's one scene in your book I want to ask you about, which I read it and I said to myself, this really happened. When the bomber crashes, there would be no reason for you to invent that. That must have been a story where a bomber on a training mission crashes into the field there, into the woods.
It did happen. Crashed on top of a mountain. But I'm fascinated with airplanes, as you can tell, and I've done a lot of research on World War II bombers like B-17s. My Uncle Robert was killed in a B-17 in November of 1943. He's the model for Troy.
For Troy, sure.
But from the day Gap Creek was published, I got emails and letters asking for a sequel.
I'll bet.
And I kept promising that I'd do a sequel. But I was halfway through the novel This Rock.
Yeah.
And when I finished that, I wanted to finish the novel Brave Enemies, set in the American Revolution.
Right.
Another historical book. And that's when my publisher asked me if I was interested in doing a biography. So I did Boone. But all this time in the back of my mind, I'm going to do a sequel to Gap Creek. I've promised people I'm going to do a sequel. Now, one reason I think I never got started on the road from Gap Creek was that I was convinced it had to be Julie's story. She's the narrator of Gap Creek.
Right.
And she would continue the story on into the 20th century. But eventually, I realized that she had had her say. She had told her story, and that it had to be her daughter, Annie, who tells the story of the next generation.
Right.
And once I got that idea, the book was written very quickly. It was as though it was dictated to me. I just had to write it down. Once I got the voice of Annie telling the story, I actually wrote the first draft in 4 months.
Oh.
And then I spent about 6 months revising it. But that was the real watershed event when I realized that it was going to be Annie telling the story.
I feel for Annie. There's a passage where Annie talks about how she would have liked to leave. It would have been nice to go to the city, and she wanted to be an actress.
Mm-hmm.
You gave her some acting talent. We don't know how much because she doesn't get a shot. Why do you give her this longing, especially this little bit of talent for the stage, say?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a talented family. Remember, Troy is an artist.
Yeah.
He's a gifted artist. She's a great dreamer. She loves to read. She is very shy. She is afraid of standing up and giving a speech as herself, but she discovers that hiding behind a character, she can get up in front of an enormous audience. And she has some acting talent. This is true, by the way, of my mother, who's the model for Annie. She had done acting, and she was invited to become a model when she was young. She never did. Her ties to Green River were so close. And since you've read the book, you know that she does eventually marry Muir.
Oh, yeah.
She realizes that really is what she meant to do all along. She just didn't know it.
She didn't want to marry a preacher, but finally she did.
But she wants to marry Muir, and he is a preacher.
I have a quick question for you. This is a ridiculous question because it's about a book you haven't written. But you've been promising for 20 years to write an academic novel. Not necessarily a Richard Russo, not necessarily a straight man, but all those years you've been at Cornell, or still are, all the years you've been in academic life, and you know you've got this English department novel in you. Mm-hmm. Are you going to do that?
Well, it's there on a back burner somewhere. I have all these other stories I got to get out of the way. My next novel, which will come out in 2015, is a story of two escaped slaves from the Carolinas who make their way along the Appalachian chain all the way to Ithaca, New York. It ends in Ithaca, New York, 1850.
Their journey, your journey. Mm-hmm. Well, you've never quit being a poet. I mean, for years, I think your first 8 books or something were books of poetry, and you continue to produce poetry. And
I do.
I would love it if you would read a couple of poems.
Okay. I'll be happy to.
For us. I have conveniently chosen poems on either side of the page. Can you see all right?
Yes, the first poem is called Shield. And by the way, when this was first published, I dedicated it to Jake Rice here at Alabama Booksmith. It was included in the anthology in his honor.
Did you? He'll like that.
The Reverend Duffy Peyton Corn, when answering a distant call by mountain paths through hollows, thickets, for his defense took only one umbrella. If a panther, bear, or mad dog leapt at him from brush, he aimed the shaft at the attacker and thrust the gadget open with a whoosh. The wolf or other foe would stop and back away, amazed by sudden burst of tiny point to giant mask with ribs and skin as black as crow or bat. With shield as light as cloth and quills, the Rev would walk unharmed through miles and years of wilderness, protected by his nerve and fabric dark as ink and bright almost as shining words. And the second poem is called Monuments. It's anybody's guess why folks will keep old cars in yards and back of houses, dead jalopies, trucks and jeeps, a station wagon or a van. They fade and peel and rust with briars and honeysuckle vines laced through the windows. Chromium and headlights flash in noonday sun. They're never sold for parts or scrap, and trees grow through the fenders, shade old hoods and trunks. Is there an urge to save these heaps like memories? Or is it loyalty to old friends, the way a horse is put to grass, or loved dog kept when it's unfit? Perhaps the presence of old chariots and steeds gives continuity to lives in veering change. The junk like family monuments and signs of sentimental worth, the house surrounded by a host of spirits and metal ghosts of days gone past, with memories of speed and glamour preserved and honored, keeping watch, as ancestors are said to do, our corpses consecrate a ground.
You've made more of cars in the yard than one would suppose.
Well, it's a scene you see often in southern Appalachia.
Oh.
The house surrounded by old cars.
I don't think you'd have to travel very far from this spot to find some cars in the yard. Thank you very much. This has been very gracious of you to take the time, and it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, too. Thank you.
To order this season of Bookmark on DVD, call 1-800-463-8825. Additional information can be found on our website at www.alabamatv.org.